All right, everybody able to hear me? All good? Awesome, thank you so much. So, yes, I am architect of ethical AI at Salesforce. And what we really wanted this section to be about is a focus on practices and how do we actually put our principles and our values into practice in the day-to-day work that we're doing. So KPMG at the beginning of the year stated that there are 5 critical hires that companies will need to be successful in 2019. And I was very happy to hear that AI ethicist is one of those top 5. And it's not surprising that that would be the case, as we have all seen in the media headlines over and over again, AI can end up causing harm. More often than not, this is unintentional. This is due to ignorance, not malice. And so having an AI ethicist to help guide the practices, guide the work that we are doing, really is going to be critical for the success of any company that's going to be creating or implementing AI. And so talk of AI and ethics really is on the rise. This was an analysis done by CB Insights, and you can see in 2017 this sharp spike in the number of mentions. More and more people are becoming aware that this is an issue that we need to figure out how to address. Now, there are dozens of what I call ethical tools that are out there. Ethics in design is not new. It may be new for many companies, but the concept itself is not new as identified by all of these different tools. In fact, Doteveryone has a document, 37-page document of all of the different tools that are out there. I highly recommend checking that out. And we've seen this explosion of AI ethics conferences and events. Some of them are AI conferences with an entire track devoted to ethics and responsible use. And some of them are conferences dedicated just to this. And we're going to be seeing more coming. So this is something people are trying to figure out in real time. So why do companies need a responsible AI practice? I would hope that this is something I wouldn't have to explain, but I think just from the sheer number of instances that we see of AI doing harm, we know this is something that we do have to convince some companies of. It's important internally because it can guide internal research and design and development decisions and really help focus priorities to get companies and individuals within those companies asking not can we do this, but should we do this? Externally, it's important because more and more companies, if you're in B2B, or customers, if you are B2C, do care about ethics. They may not use the words ethics, they may not think of it in terms of ethics, but they want to know that the products that they're buying, that they are designed responsibly. And so you need to be able to communicate increasingly how you are doing that. And of course, if we think about nothing else, it helps you avoid legal and PR risk. Competitively, ethics is going to become a competitive differentiator. It may not be today, but it will become a differentiator. And finally, I would hope we all want to be the change that we want to see in the world. There have been a ton of ethical principles and guidelines published, but they all come down to about the same 5 core themes. AI should be responsible. That means it needs to safeguard human rights and protect the data that it's entrusted with. It needs to be accountable. So it needs to seek feedback from all of those stakeholders that it impacts. It needs to be auditable. It must also be transparent. So explaining and communicating through the user experience why the AI is doing what it's doing. It should also be empowering. It shouldn't be focused sheerly on optimizing the human out of the loop. It should be empowering and making society better for all. And then finally, it really does need to be inclusive. It needs to respect the societal values of everyone and not just the creators who are designing and building those AI systems. So how do we put these principles into practice? How do we measure what success looks like? How do we know if we are getting better today than yesterday? These are the really big questions that many of us as practitioners are trying to think through. You can have great intentions, but unless you know how to measure if you are getting better or not, it's a very hard thing to do. So a colleague of mine, Danielle Cass, who is a director of AI ethics at Workday, she and I created a survey, and we sent it out to our networks and the PAI, the Partnership on AI, their membership list, and then also did just snowball recruiting, asking people to share it out in their networks with the people that also work on ethics and tech. We got 108 respondents from people in ethical roles. There are many different names right now for this, but they are practitioners, consultants, and researchers. And it covered US and Europe. This was something that we wanted to get a much more diverse response set, but for right now, that was what we were able to access. And then we followed up in the end of February with a workshop in San Francisco, and we got 23 of the participants who filled out the survey to also come on site so that we could dig deep into understanding how are people working, what's worked well for them, what are the biggest challenges that they're facing, and why. So I thought I would share with you today what's working and what the biggest challenges are that we all need to think about how to resolve. And then hopefully, if you're in a similar role, you can take advantage of some of these insights. So the first key tip that the workshop participants shared was having access to experts. That includes things like office hours or review boards. So having a group of individuals so that anybody within the company who has questions, they can come and get feedback. One of the tips that they found is to have an intake form, just a really simple form that asks people to fill out, what's your question? What's the information that you need to know? And that's for a couple of reasons. It forces people to do some upfront work and be able to articulate what is the challenge, what are the things that they're working on, maybe ask them to include a link to the product development guidelines or some other document of the product that they are working on. But then also, it helps you prepare in advance and see, are there other people that you might want to bring into that conversation? So everybody comes into that conversation fully prepared. The next is to leverage existing processes. I think for a lot of us, when we're brand new in a role, it's very tempting to create net new processes when that's really not necessary. At the beginning, I mentioned that there's 37 pages worth of existing ethical tools that you can take advantage of, but also look at your internal processes. So for example, if you are on the agile development methodology at your company, you should have a definition of ready and definition of done. You can add ethical questions into those two steps of your agile methodology, and it doesn't significantly change how people are already working, but just adds some extra questions for them to think about. If you have any machine learning or other AI classes for employees at your company, you should also add in ethical education into that training. Start developing an ethical mindset among individuals as they are working on AI, because they may not have had these classes or these topics in their training in school. They may never have been in a company that has had them ask these types of questions. Product reviews are another great place. If your company really does value ethics or the responsible creation of technology, there should be a discussion of that in product reviews among executives. So again, Take what already exists, leverage those, and don't create any net new processes unless you really need it and you have the buy-in for it. Third recommendation is to create digestible, role-specific content. Just as there are a ton of ethical tools out there, there's quite a lot of education available, like from the Margulis Center, for example, about ethics in tech or ethics in AI. These kinds of generic case studies can be very interesting. But for an individual who is focused on what their key deliverables are, they want to know, how do I apply this specifically to the work that I'm doing today? Tell me exactly what I need to know so that I can work differently today. So it should be specific to the role, whether it's engineering, design, marketing, legal. What are the things that those roles really should take into consideration? Checklists are super easy. I always say ethics is a mindset, not a checklist, but checklists are really helpful as people are working on problems. You can also create one-page documents of guidelines or principles to keep in mind, but you should also be documenting the decisions and deliberations that are being made. This helps people learn from other difficult challenges or conversations that are happening throughout the organization. It also increases transparency so that people understand, why did we decide to do A and not B? And it can help with consistency so that one business unit isn't deciding to do A and another business unit is deciding to do B, and there's no good explanation for why. So documentation for others to learn from is really important. Final recommendation is to create empowerment and agency at every level in every function. You must have a tops-down and a bottoms-up approach to be successful. One of the workshop attendees, Norberto Andrade, said that ethics lives in the small design decisions that are made each day. You can't possibly be in every meeting, every business unit where important decisions are being made. So you need everybody throughout the organization to be able to make those decisions in your absence. So you need the sponsors. Those are the leaders from above that are lifting you up. They are bringing you into the conversations that you might not normally have access to. They're also providing access to resources that you're going to need to be successful. Maybe it starts off with a sponsor for one business unit, not the entire company, but you build wins one success at a time. Your supporters are the other people throughout the organization. These are the people that are doing the work each day. They have the religion. They are there channeling you in each of those meetings. And some of your biggest successes and impact in the company may very well be the work that they are doing that was inspired by you. All right, so the open questions. Here are the things that are the big challenges that we are still wrestling with. The first is, how do we measure impact? So I alluded to this in the beginning. How do you measure harm avoided because you worked responsibly to begin with? How do you know if you have actually had impact? Many companies have OKRs, objectives and key results. At Salesforce, we have V2MOM, vision, values, metrics, methods, and objectives or obstacles. These are things where you actually have to measure what have you done. So trying to figure out, how do we measure, are we getting better today than we were yesterday, is something we're all trying to figure out. And of course, the lengthy timelines to implementation from process to outcome can also be a challenge. So you have to take a long view. Next, how do we scale this practice across an organization? There are so many different business units and roles that are available in a company. And so trying to figure out how you embed these practices throughout and have the resources available is something that we are grappling with. Third, how do we create a shared taxonomy? These words, ethical, responsible, biased, fair, they mean different things to different people, especially if you're, say, an engineer versus someone in legal, where these words have a very specific connotation in legal circles. So if you have different definitions, it's going to make it difficult to have a shared conversation and come up with an agreement. Finally, how do we operationalize ethics? How do we create those tools and guidelines that work for each of those business units? How do we know that they're going to be used consistently across an organization? And how do we change incentive structures? Right now, many companies, especially engineering or tech companies, are rewarding individuals based on launch, revenue, user engagement, clicks. Those types of things don't necessarily support an ethical framework. So how do we change up the incentive structure where we're not saying profits don't matter, but we are saying that working responsibly does? So just want to wrap it up. This is a phrase that I say quite a lot. Some people attribute this aphorism to John F. Kennedy, but this is actually a Chinese saying that's existed for centuries. A rising tide lifts all boats. Although working ethically can be a competitive advantage, it's important that we all work together, that we share our insights of what's working. How do we all come together to define what this responsible AI practice is? Because we all get better as a society, because high tide really does rise all boats. All right, so we're now going to move into a panel. I am very happy to say that I have 3 fantastic ethical practitioners here with me today, so I'm going to introduce them to you. First up, we have the very freezing Rachel Coldicutt. She is the CEO of Doteveryone, which, if you are not familiar with it, it is a fantastic independent think tank that champions responsible technology. Her focus is on putting ethics into practice in business, in government, and in civil society. She's spent the last 20 years turning emerging technology into products and services and has helped many organizations adapt to the digital world. Rachel has created and delivered large-scale content-driven services for Microsoft, BBC, and Channel 4, was a pioneer in the UK digital arts sector, and has consulted for many FTSE companies across a range of sectors, including finance, energy, and healthcare, and she sits on a number of ethical and advisory boards for corporate and charitable projects. Next, we have Luke Church. He is an affiliated lecturer at the Computer Laboratory in Cambridge and the Director of Innovation and Learning at Africa's Voices Foundation, which is super cool. Highly recommend you check out their organization. He leads technology research and media teams. Luke's research seeks to improve the experience that people have with socio-technical systems, including programming languages, AI systems, buildings, public policy, and humanitarian interventions. And recently, he founded Lark Systems to explore ways of integrating different forms of intelligence. And last, but absolutely not least, is Julie Dawson, who leads the ethics framework development for the Yoti digital identity platform. Digital identity enables people to prove who they are or how old they are. Digital identity can be a game changer for rebuilding trust. It empowers consumers, but it can also be misused for surveillance or to exclude people. Yoti is a founding B Corp. B Corps are for-profit businesses committed to growing profits and purpose in parallel. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you to take a few minutes to tell us about how you are weaving ethics throughout your organization.
Hello. Right. Oh, it is cold. So
I can see my breath.
Maybe everyone can, like, I don't know, the cheer or shake their hands or something. So hi. So I run a think tank. And our work is really about how to turn a lot of the talk about ethics into easy, everyday things. And we started this journey about 3 years ago with a hunch that there could be ways of making technology differently that would lead to better outcomes. And I've spent lots of time over the years working in product teams, and I was really aware that they tend to be quite inward-looking and quite insular, and so the challenge that we had is how to open that up. And we have just done a survey, which I'll be talking about later this afternoon, but the two really interesting things that came out of this. We spoke to just over 1,000 people working in the industry in the UK, and the headlines that are relevant here are that only 2% of people think that ethical codes help. And there are loads of codes. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And that actually the things that people were really after were practical company visions and ways of working. The thing that really came out is that, particularly in AI, where lots of people we found that 1 in 6 people have left the job because of the negative ethical impact of that work, which is huge. That's loads of people. Right, and so actually those people are really after practical things. And we have spent a long time trying to think about how to do that. And I will just tell you really quickly, I think a little bit more about the journey that has entailed. We started off thinking about a trust mark and trying to think, is it possible that every purchaser or user of a piece of software has maybe the equivalent to the trademark? And I can tell you the answer is no. It took us a long time to work this out. And it's partly because I think if you compare, say, software of any kind to bananas, right, the difference is the software is living, and it changes every time a person interacts, right, and it lives in the world, whereas kind of a banana is a banana, right? So having thought about that, we then started to think about how can we actually make it easy for people who have jobs, who have lots of things to think about, to just add things into how they're working. And we have a site here that's got a number of tools. I think the 3 important things that we've settled on are supporting people who aren't engineers, but are people who are around engineering. And so the first thing is, how can boards come up with metrics that are actually helpful? How can ethics be at the heart of delivery for everyone? We have spoken to loads of teams who have said we're being asked to be ethical and being asked to deliver against metrics that totally undermine that. And so we'll start there. The next thing is we've been looking at how to upgrade the agile process and thinking about what are the really easy rhythms and routines to fit into that. We're really aware we don't want to be asking people to do different things or be learning extra skills. And then importantly, this isn't a thing that belongs to an ethicist, out of the team. It belongs to the whole team. And lastly, we are working on kind of changing how we think about user design and thinking about understanding the context that we're operating in creating the software. So we've just started. We launched our first resource about 2 months ago. Our challenge now is getting it out there. And we have a stand in the expo if anybody is interested in finding out more. Thank you.
I think it's, yeah, Luke, you're next.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk a bit about Africa's Voices Foundation. So what it is that we do is pretty much written on the slide, right? So we listen intelligently to achieve impact, and we listen intelligently to citizens on their own terms. That's a nice kind of platitude-sounding thing. Let's try and talk through a bit about what that actually means in practice. So an example might be that at the moment, for example, we're very interested in different group relations going on within Somali contexts at the moment. So we'd run a radio show where we have a kind of the media part, so there's two characters, they're falling in love, they're wondering about whether they should get married. And one of them is from a minority group within Somalia, and the other is from a majority. And so people would encourage people to text in their opinions. And if you do this, there's a couple of reasons for following this strategy. First of all, we're not imposing a frame on anybody. So we're not acting as in, you can have the conversation, but you can only have the conversation in terms that we set, which is what you get if you provide someone with a fixed choice survey. The second is that what we're creating is a space where people actually really want to talk. So in this context of this media show, people really want to talk about the issues. And so we get a lot of these text messages. So they're not easy to interpret. They're not the kinds of things that you could count with a standard process, because they're actually real voices, people talking in their own terms, in colloquial contexts, in their own local languages, about really complicated, very sensitive topics. And so the question is, if you want to curate a conversation like this, you're going to have tens to hundreds of thousands of these messages that you have to be able to turn around in a short enough time to really be able to maintain a conversation. And so we turn to technology to help us do that. But this is now a difficult problem, right? So how is it, in that context, how is it that we can think and maintain this principle of not imposing a frame on the conversation that is going on? And we do that in a number of ways. So one of which is that we do not seek to automate the analysis and interpretation of what is going on. We could just build systems that just counted what people were saying, but that isn't actually providing any sense of understanding. So instead what we say is that actually, for really complicated subjects like this, the goal is not to have a computer sensing it. The goal is to have a person, a researcher, able to understand it. And we use AI techniques to make it so that that researcher can read tens to hundreds of thousands of messages, but the understanding lies in the researcher, not in the computer. The second thing that we do in practice is that we maintain provenance of all of our information. So for any given outcome that we might say of, here are the broad sets of beliefs that we think this community has, we can trace from that outcome back to something, a voice a citizen said to us. And the third thing is that this is now a really fascinating problem, right, of the how is it that people think about these really sensitive, really challenging topics. It's something that's actually really genuinely interesting to understand. So we designed the systems so that the user interfaces of all of them promote a kind of a sense of curiosity in the researchers working within the system. They don't promote the answer that the computer is right. They try and encourage doubt in the statistical analysis, or try and encourage other questions that might not have been asked. So this kind of design to augment rather than automate the sense of provenance tracing and the sense of curiosity enablement is, I think, the kind of the three broad practical design approaches that we've been taking throughout all of the systems.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Julie, if you want to grab the clicker.
Oh, thank you. Thank
there
you.
you go.
So, Julie Dawson, I'm from Yoti, which is a digital identity platform. A lot of people who I might mention that to, friends I haven't seen for a while, sort of look at me curiously, digital identity. And really, it's all about how do you, in all sorts of different parts of your life, prove who you are. It could be, for instance, arriving as a speaker. How is it they know that you're the right speaker and you're not just, walking in and being an imposter? It could be when you're on a dating site. How does somebody know you're actually of the gender and age that you say you are? Or traveling to an airport, buying a bottle of wine in a supermarket. Lots of different contexts. We need to prove age or identity. And the way this has happened to date happens to be normally you're trotting around with your passport or driving license, if you have one. So just taking the UK, we have about a third of all under 18s that don't have a photo ID document. It might be because they're not traveling. They're not old enough yet to have a car. Their parents don't take them on holiday. And even for over 18s in the UK, we have 24% without a photo ID. And if you look at that on a global level, the World Bank estimates between 1.5 and 2 billion people in the world just don't have a root identity document. So we've two different areas within Yoti. One is looking at overall how people that do have documents can prove who they are. And we have a 3 to 5 minute setup, and then in a couple of hours, any organization can do checks and find out that you are the person you say you are. But then we started to look at this principle of how do we make this available to all, proving who you are or how old you are. And we set up some principles right at the beginning, including making a digital identity approach available to everyone and putting the consumer at the heart of it. And we started to look at what could you do that wouldn't require someone to set up an app and that wouldn't require them to have a document. And we have a very rich data set through people that are onboarding, where we're looking to prevent fraud, that we've started to learn what does a 20-year-old face look like? What does a 30-year-old face look like? And we've built with a neural network an approach that can actually estimate age. The way it does it is just looks at you and the image is instantly deleted. So what we did earlier this year was to actually refine that more. And we thought we've got to do this in a really open and transparent way. We're a B Corps, which has meant that over the last few years, we have gone down a track of always inviting scrutiny. We have an external council of guardians, and actually Gavin Starks is speaking on another stage today, one of our guardians, who looks specifically at the open data, open source community. Renata Avila is a Latin American human rights lawyer, and we have consumer rights activists, Doc Searle. They meet quarterly. All the minutes are published openly, and we're inviting their scrutiny, they're holding us to account. You can ask them any question, they can ask us any question, and it's all documented. So we tried to bring the same approach and scrutiny through to this AI approach, and brought together, after having looked at these multiple frameworks, a group of practitioners to really thrash through the unintended consequences, and then publish a white paper. And the things that were really important to people was, well, how good is this for men and specifically for women? How good is this across people with different skin tones? And bringing that diversity to light. So we've actually published very openly a white paper. I think, so that is the white paper, and that is specifically the section that looks at the mean average error rate across the genders, male and female, looks at the different age bands, and we update that every sort of 2 months approximately. Can I go backwards on that one? Yes. So that's the age scan white paper. We've also signed up to the Biometrics Institute's principles around safe AI and ethics, and similarly another paper that's come out of a safe face pledge that's come out of MIT, looking specifically at the inclusiveness and a non-surveillance, which is pretty much an ethos that we have running throughout the Yoti system. With the main identity app, we chop up all the attributes, give someone the private key, and only they can choose who they share their details with. And with the age estimation, the user is just looking into the camera area, which could be, for instance, at a supermarket self-checkout. It could also be with a live streaming platform. We're working with, just for instance, one live streaming platform has done over 22 million age estimates. They have a chat room for 13 to 7-year-olds and another for over 18s. And as part of their ongoing safety measures, they wanted to know that people were in the right self-asserted area, and have found that significant tens of thousands were not in the right self-asserted area. So I think there's a relatively benign use cases in that there are other options at the supermarket self-checkout. It's something which is quite a moment of friction for both the members of staff, really hard to train people to look at documents from around the world. And when you are in the supermarket, you're normally wanting to get out, if you're anything like me. So that's, I think, just a really quick review of the different types of approaches that we've done, which is bringing together experts and looking very specifically to be open about how good and how bad the actual algorithms are. And looking at how that can help throw a spotlight and give a really sort of concrete example of something in everyday life that can make life safer and simpler, and that builds on these principles of transparency. Yep, I think that's.
All right. So wanted to jump into a few questions. So obviously the problems that you are each tackling is massive. And so how do you scale?
Sure. So I think it's interesting to think about what it is that we mean by the word scaling as it's typically been used in the tech industry. And it's essentially a socioeconomic position of a system that scales as one where the profit aggregates to the tech company and the work aggregates to the distributed population. And that means that as the tech company increases the number of people working through the system, they increase profit, and they don't necessarily have to pay the working cost. There's often been an argument made that that's kind of the way it has to be in order to bring the benefits of technology to large audiences. So I think IVF's approach is an interesting counterpoint to that, of saying, actually, we'll do the interpretation. So you say whatever you want to us, and we'll pay the cost of trying to understand and work out what that means. And in theory, that doesn't scale, right? In practice, what we've found is that by building some careful workflow design, by building some user interfaces to support people, and then by applying AI to augment the capabilities of the researchers, we can deal in an entirely cost-effective manner with hundreds of thousands of data points. So I think in some sense, scaling happens if you try it. Try taking it seriously. Try paying the cost yourself and see what happens.
Interesting.
Building on that, I'd say that part of it will also be the sectors where this can be actually used.
Yeah.
And we've all got really used to, over the last few years, tapping with Apple Pay, for instance. Nobody would have thought 5 years ago that that type of an approach would have become very prevalent. And we're on the cusp of a couple of different major changes in just the area we're working on with age estimation. And that this year with the Digital Economy Act in the UK, between 10 and 20 million UK adults will need to age verify to access adult content, which has been designed to prevent young children stumbling across content they're not age appropriate enough to handle. And then if you look next year in the UK, the work of Baroness Kidron and iRights, 5 Rights, looking at the age-appropriate design code, companies are going to be challenged to look at, are they actually dealing with young people online in the right way? What is the duty of care that is implicit, and how, in terms of customer service, terms, the whole user experience, how you deal with people differently? So we're starting to see that, be it from the worlds of online dating, gaming, gambling, classifieds, social media, all of these different sectors, as well as retail, online and offline, are looking at how these approaches could be used. And once a technology has got an ethical review, hopefully it's something that invites very strong scrutiny of the unintended consequences, because it could potentially have use in those other areas. And that's what we're keen to do at the moment.
Excellent.
And I guess kind of our approach to scaling is slightly different, because really we're now engaged in the job of going out and advocating, talking to businesses, getting them involved with the work that we're doing, which is a challenge because we're tiny. There are 14 of us. And now it feels like a good time to say that we are hiring. If anyone would like to come and help us spread this work. So I think to us the issue is, how can you make it easy to do and easy to take on without being all about kind of huge ethical problems?
All right. So what is the biggest challenge that you are facing in your current role, and how are you trying to tackle it?
For us, one of the very next tricky issues will be looking at age estimation for younger demographics. So at the moment, we've only dealt with people aged 13 and above, because that was where our app has been designed from. However, we're getting lots of interest from organizations that are saying, well, for example, I'm a gambling company, and we're seeing people as young as 5 and 6 are getting addicted to loot boxes or skins gambling.
Wow.
The likes of large dating sites have had people under 10 going on adult dating sites.
That is mind-blowing.
There's now increasing demand to start to look at younger data sets. And so one of the things we're doing is convening a group of organizations who are very, strongly steeped around the child protection area, and getting their input. A little bit like an ethical committee review you might have at a university before kicking off a project, because we would like to say, well, we invited review and scrutiny for the over 13s approach. What should be the scrutiny that should be brought by civil society and other organizations if you're going to take that type of approach wider?
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem that I face with kind of challenges in AI ethics on a regular basis is that I think the rhetoric of AI has become largely detached from reality. So the claims as to what AI can and can't do, from a technical background, I can evaluate a lot of those claims, and a lot of them simply just don't appear to be real. But that means that it's a very difficult space, because I'm often working primarily with people who aren't from a technology background, who look at the proposals that we give them of, say, this is the kind of complex analysis we're going to do, this is the acts of interpretation that we really want people to support. And they're like, but there's this magic pixie dust over here that will do it all, and they only want $1,000 a year. Why do you need so much resource to actually solve these problems? And of course, that's kind of okay if you're in spaces where dealing with the 80% cases where the pixie dust does work is fine. If you're actually in a context which has an ethical commitment to reach everybody, then the pixie dust actually harms people, and real people. And so there's I think the biggest challenge, and kind of going to what we were talking about earlier, of a way in which organizations can articulate what works and what doesn't work, and can be public. We can have a kind of moment of public confessional about the bits of AI that don't do what they say on the tin, would be really useful.
Awesome.
And I actually have two things. The first is, it's really easy to get caught up in the story of the day. And so, there are lots of ethical dilemmas that are suddenly becoming very newsworthy. And I suppose our challenge is to continue to hold a space in which people are able to think about how their technology works in the widest sense without getting distracted by particular issues or kind of going crazy over blockchain, say, when actually they're probably doing a much more straightforward thing. And the other thing, we work quite closely with governments looking at better regulatory environments. And I think that is the biggest challenge. And bridging, I suppose, the lack of technical understanding in government with a desire for really quick outcomes and immediate change in things that could be systems that continue for years and years and years. And so I think probably overall, it's like, how do we reframe this as a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year problem. To Kathy's point, understanding the impact of technology is here to stay. It isn't a fad, and how to continue to push that on.
Now, I feel obligated to acknowledge we are not a racially diverse panel. We have some gender representation, different locations, different backgrounds. But the issue of diversity in AI is a huge challenge that we are trying to grapple with in many ways. How are you addressing issues of diversity within your organizations?
Okay. Well, we found specifically, both in our organization and in this piece of work, that is quite a crucial area. We do have a very international team, and the gender bias is one that we work very hard to keep trying to address. We're also trying to do more in terms of the LGBTQ diversity, neurodiversity, a range of different areas. In this work with age estimation, one of the things we found was that it wasn't as accurate as we wanted, and specifically for the darkest skin tone and ladies in the 40 to sort of 50 age group, we were being overly flattering. So a lady that was nearer 50, we were thinking she was more like 40, which is maybe not the greatest sin, but we still didn't think was fair enough. So we did specific work with some NGOs in Kenya to address that, and is something we will keep looking at on an ongoing basis. We're also doing some work through a charity called Sparkle, which is a transgender charity based up in Manchester, because we want to see that want to look at the unintended consequences around the gender diversity angle. And there's also other areas you might not have thought, but beards can make a fraction of an instance impact as well on the age estimation. So we've done some specific work looking at what is the impact of beards, how material is that, and it's not hugely material is the conclusion. But again, it was something that we will be publishing and adding in to give this richness of view.
It's fascinating. Did you?
Yeah, so it's hugely important to us to be representative, and it continues to be a challenge, partly because we're not a big team, and so we're constantly both working with external organisations to improve our understanding. And actually, the other thing that we're doing, as well as having completely changed our approach to hiring in the last year, we do lots of design research and ethnography in order that all of our work is really based in kind of real lives, real opinions. It isn't just kind of things that occur to us. And I think that actually a lot of the ethical issues we're facing as a sector would be improved enormously by being more representative. And one of the issues, probably in a weird way, the hardest one, is the moment a person is working in software engineering, they have almost been moved into a privileged life, and that probably ongoing, the hardest thing is kind of looking out of that bubble and continuing to work with real people in ways that are including and not exploiting them.
Yeah, so I really resonate with that. I mean, so in a slightly unusual position here compared to previous work in the tech industry, in that 60% of our employees are women, about 61% of them are from are East African in origin. So that, in some ways, that sounds great, but it's nowhere near enough, right? Of what that means is that we have some demographic representation within the organization. It's really helpful, but it doesn't matter if the challenges and problems that we're addressing are still set by white men. It doesn't matter that the demographics might be more representative. So the real prize here isn't to just align those identities, though that's clearly very important. It's also to start looking at how is it that we can build systems and organizations that work to the problems, where the problems are set, the goals of the organization are set by the communities that we're working within? And I think thinking about ways of doing that is an interesting kind of route forwards for how is it that we can build genuine diversity into the way that technical platforms get used to enable people to solve problems that they care about. One of the ways that we've been thinking about doing that is kind of inverting the traditional logic of you decide what problem you want to go and solve, you then try and attract funding and people to go and solve that problem. And say, let's assemble a community, a group of people, a group of friends that we want to work with that align to some kind of distribution, and then let's decide as a community what problems we're going to go out and solve. That's an interesting kind of proposal. The challenges tend to be that it doesn't align very well with the way that funding works, for example. And so looking at how is it that we can provide alternative models that support integrating that from the beginning seems like an interesting challenge going forwards.
Just one other thing that I forgot to mention that I think is perhaps helpful, and it's slightly different than the view that you'd had earlier, Kathy, with regards keeping within the sort of functional lines and not creating something separate around ethics. One of the things we found that was almost a bottom-up request was to upskill more people across all the different teams in the business. So we've actually created an ethics internal sort of team or working group that works alongside the product teams and all the other different functions. But there's a mixture of junior to senior. Again, we've tried to get a really diverse mix. So some people from our 24/7 security operations team, from the customer service and support team that again is a 24/7 group, through R&D, through design. So it brings a very different set of voices on your sort of cultural demographic backgrounds, experience, ages. And that's something that we found to be, it's almost like a really good sounding board for people that are trying to make a decision within maybe one functional team or in the R&D group. And it's a group of extra people they can just go to and muse over something with, or bring it more formally as a considered topic.
Excellent. So, final question. So, what is one piece of advice that you give to anyone implementing a responsible AI practice in their organizations?
Do it. I mean, I think that the thing that we have seen over the last couple of years is it's really easy to come up with like, oh, well, maybe next year, maybe in the next cycle, maybe after this thing has happened. I would say begin in a small way and kind of learn and change.
I would agree with that one. I think we're quite a small organisation that probably from when we were about 50 people kicked off down this route. Before really there were many scorecards or approaches or principles there. Now there are more and more of them, almost that it can be quite confusing. So you do have to start somewhere small. But I think having something that goes across your business, maybe like an initial set of principles that you can get top management agreement to, and have something that all the way from induction all the way through people understand is the approach that your business wants at the top level. It then becomes much easier. And actually just blogging about decisions that you've made, or running a workshop and getting people in and then blogging about those decisions forces you to be more open about the approach you're going through. We talk about some of our ethics sessions in the family meetings, as well as making all those minutes available to people so that within the company, more people are understanding the decisions that are happening.
Yeah, that documentation and transparency is so important. I think it's something that many organizations or many individuals really dislike. They dread that extra type of work, but it's so critical for success in these cases.
So I think I would go back to the kind of beginning of the talk where I was saying, there's, in some sense, don't turn AI into something exotic. There's the design challenges that we face as to how do we deploy AI within an organization are not actually radically different from design challenges as to how do we deploy other forms of technology within an organization in an appropriate way. And it's kind of, there are ways of thinking about that that have stood the test of time. One of them that I've been thinking a lot about is essentially trying to split the problem space into two. So design for the case where AI doesn't work. And once you've got that designed, you can start then you're in a safer space in some sense, for deploying AI across an organization. And just as we wouldn't say, if we designed a piece of user interface, a piece of design, and it didn't work, we wouldn't say, oh, well, that was the only option we had. We'd go and replace it, right? So if your AI components that you're proposing to deploy don't support designing doubt, don't support human curiosity, don't support what it is that your organization is trying to do, replace them.
The importance of iteration, feedback, iteration, listening to your users, getting that feedback. We actually have a couple more minutes. Would any of you like to leave us with any final words?
I think one of the programs that we went on was your responsible tech trust marking. And I think one of the frameworks that you recommended that we're going to look at is this framework that you described to me earlier.
Yes, the consequence scanning. So we've developed an agile event that helps the teams to understand and record the intended and unintended consequences of the technology they're creating. And I think most importantly, it leads to you creating a log of those and understanding that things that you're able to act on now, that things it's worth monitoring, and that things that are out of your control, but you're able to influence. And we've worked with dozens of teams over the last year to understand how to make this work. We released it, I think, in May, so it's really early days. And tomorrow we're running a workshop here if anybody is interested in signing up and going to that.
So I'd like to use that for our next workshop, and we'll let you know how it goes on.
Brilliant, thank you.
Excellent.